China has spent the last couple of decades turning itself into the primary military power player in the Pacific region. Modernization, which has seen the People's Liberation Army grow massively, new equipment being built, and even the development of nuclear weapons, gives China everything it needs to throw its weight around. Japan has had enough. While lingering under a cloud of doubt over how much it can rely on the United States, Japan is getting ready for a potential war with China. And the message coming out of the country is clear: Japan wants to build nukes. At least some in Japan are increasingly looking toward nuclear weapons as a potential deterrent to the growing Chinese threat, as well as a way to further extricate Japan from underneath the United States' security umbrella. On August 20th, Reuters reported on a Japanese lawmaker named Rui Matsukawa. Formerly a deputy defense minister, Matsukawa visited the UK's Fordham Abbey back in March, where she met British lawmakers undergoing an enormous rethink about the role that the US is playing in that country's security. At the time, US President Donald Trump had an axe to grind with Europe, seemingly as a collective, over issues related to how much its countries pay for their own security and their over-reliance on the US military. Trump also appeared to be leaning a little too close to Russia for the comfort of many European leaders, with the message Matsukawa came away with being simple: it would be a good idea if Japan started doing the same. Matsukawa explained what that might look like. Trump is so unpredictable, which is his strength maybe, but I think we always have to think about Plan B, the Japanese lawmaker told Reuters. As for what Plan B would entail, she outlined a very general pathway that Japan should at least consider taking. Plan B is maybe go independent, then go nukes. For most other countries, the desire to go nuclear would at least be understandable, if not especially viable, but for Japan, it was until recently almost unthinkable. Ever since the end of World War II, military doctrine in Japan has focused primarily on pacifism, with the country preferring diplomacy over obvious military threats to get its way. However, with the uncertainty surrounding the defense relationship between the US and Japan, along with China's growing strength and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, an approach that has worked for decades up until now is starting to look very shaky. But we'll get back to all of that later in the video. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Matsukawa's comments is that they're not claims coming from an isolated lawmaker who is going against the grain of the rest of the country. As Reuters points out, there is a small, yet not insignificant, contingent of the Japanese public that believes the country should be looking into developing its own nuclear weapons program. That sentiment is even stronger in South Korea, which is allied to both the US and Japan via a trilateral agreement. Reuters says that up to 75% of the South Korean public favors the country building its own nuclear weapons, likely because their country is sandwiched between the definitely nuclear-capable China and the possibly nuclear-capable North Korea. Though support for a nuclear program in Japan isn't as strong among the country's public, it's certainly there. At the very least, many in Japan are pushing for the country to at least give the nuclear issue some thought, as Politics Today points out. While outright support for Japan developing its own nuclear arsenal remains relatively low, opinion polls suggest growing willingness to reconsider the nation's traditional 3 non-nuclear principles, the outlet says. Hiroshima native Tatsuaki Takahashi, whose grandfather survived the atomic bombing in 1945, noted that as the trauma of that tragedy recedes into history, more Japanese are open to rethinking the nation's nuclear policy. That's an interesting point to make. Japan is still the only country to have felt the devastating impact of nuclear weapons firsthand with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those 2 nuclear strikes conducted by the US using nuclear bombs far less powerful than those that exist today killed an estimated 74,000 people in Nagasaki and another 140,000 in Hiroshima, with 38,000 of the dead being children, according to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Faced with such dreadful power, Japan surrendered to the United States, effectively bringing about the end of World War II. From there, Japan could have focused on getting its revenge. Isolated from the public eye, it could have had its scientists work on nuclear weapons, but Japan went in a different direction. The pacifism we mentioned earlier arose out of the horrors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. So too did the 3 non-nuclear principles that Politics Today mentions, albeit several decades later. DBpedia says that the 3 non-nuclear principles are a Japanese parliamentary resolution that, though not officially adopted into law, have guided Japan's nuclear policy since they were created in the 1960s. Those principles are simple. Japan shall never possess nuclear weapons. Japan shall never manufacture nuclear weapons. Japan shall never permit the introduction of nuclear weapons onto its territory. You can't get a more cut-and-dry anti-nuclear approach than that. And it's likely no coincidence that these principles were adopted at the height of the Cold War between the US and Russia, as those 2 countries raced to stockpile more nuclear weapons than would ever be needed to destroy the entire world. Attempting to defer and get one over on the other in equal measure, Japan seemed determined to go in the opposite direction. Diplomacy would always win the day ahead of maintaining a nuclear threat, the message seemed to be at the time. However, a lot has changed since the 1960s, and the situation in which Japan now finds itself may necessitate a change in approach. As Reuters puts it, but interviews with a dozen Japanese lawmakers, government officials, and former senior military figures reveal there is a growing willingness to loosen Japan's decades-old pledge, formulated in 1961, not to produce, possess, or host nuclear weapons in its territory, what is known as the three non-nuclear principles. This is the final security taboo for Japan. As Reuters says, August marks the 80th anniversary of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings. A fact won't be lost on those within the country who are arguing for nuclear armament, though they could also argue that the three non-nuclear principles have never been quite what they seemed. Sure, Japan has never built, hosted, or possessed any nuclear weapons, meaning the principles haven't been broken. However, there is an argument to be made that these principles have managed to stay in place for as long as they have because of Japan's close military alliance with the US. Again, as Reuters points out, until now, Japan has relied on US nuclear weapons, which once laid waste to Nagasaki and Hiroshima to deter modern-day threats. In a security agreement called Extended Deterrence, Washington has committed to use the full range of its military capabilities, including nuclear, to defend Japan and other allies. Japan doesn't need to have or build its own nukes when it falls under the nuclear umbrella of a country that can launch nukes almost anywhere in the world via submarines, stealth bombers, and by using world-spanning intercontinental ballistic missiles. While it would be unfair to call Japan hypocritical for benefiting from this protection, it also doesn't change the suggestion that such a powerful and advanced nation, one that is very capable of building nuclear weapons, can only maintain such pacifistic principles because of the protection it has from its allies. Now the umbrella might be closing, and that brings us back to the reasons why some in Japan are now arguing that it's time to ditch the three non-nuclear principles for good. The comments made by Matsukawa, which we shared earlier in the video, show that the US is playing a big role in this new line of thought, giving us our first two reasons why Japan now wants nukes. We touched on the European awakening Matsukawa discussed, and it's important to remember that her meeting in the UK happened during March of this year, when the US stance on everything from Europe to the Ukraine war was much different from what it seems to be now. Cast your mind back to March, and you might remember that it was the month in which Trump and his administration didn't have a lot of kind words to say about Europe. That month saw both Politico and Reuters publish detailed articles discussing what then seemed to be a conscious effort by the United States to move away from Europe. Politico was the more sensationalist of the two, leading with a headline that blared about how Trump wanted to destroy the European Union or EU so he could rebuild it in his own image. The outlet noted that Trump had found vulnerabilities in the EU through the chaos caused by his decision to withdraw US military aid from Ukraine at the time. That decision was quickly reversed, but it still showed that Trump was increasingly being seen as a maverick in global geopolitics, a man whose choices couldn't be predicted, and who often seemed to make decisions that flew in the face of long-held alliances. Politico also highlighted that Trump held the belief that the EU seemed to have been created to screw the United States. And with Trump holding meetings with both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin without the involvement of the former's European allies, there seemed to be a clear attempt to divide Europe in play. Reuters was a little less aggressive toward US policy in this article, though it did claim that it had taken just 3 weeks up to March 10th for Europe to realize that a 75-year-old alliance with the US was coming apart. It highlighted how US Vice President J.D. Vance had harangued European leaders during the February Munich conference. An explosive meeting between Vance, Trump, and Zelensky at the White House a short while later only added fuel to the budding fire of the newfound US contempt for Europe. On March 12th, Trump was also pledging to match the EU along with Canada when they both said they would implement retaliatory tariffs in response to US tariffs on their territories. Alienation of allies didn't seem to be enough. Sparking a trade war wasn't out of the question. A few months have passed since then. The relationship between the US and Europe is decidedly more cooperative. Still, this period of uncertainty left its scars, and Japan was paying attention. The obvious question had to be asked: if the US could treat such long-standing allies this way, could it do the same to Japan? The US has also taken actions that more directly at Japan and call into question the current nature of the alliance between the two countries. Take Trump's recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power, for instance. The US president referred to North Korea as a nuclear power in January, mere hours after he'd taken office upon winning the presidential election, and those words sent shockwaves through Japan. Granted, they were likely a slip of the tongue rather than an official recognition of North Korea's nuclear status. After all, July 29th saw Al Jazeera report that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister was calling on the US to officially recognize the country's status as a nuclear-armed state. But for some, Trump's comment revealed the truth about how he, and perhaps his administration, really viewed North Korea. These comments followed on from Trump's first term in office, during which he met Kim Jong-un in an event that the Observer Research Foundation said disrupted the legacy of the cooperation between the US and Japan by seeing Trump take a decidedly US-first approach to dealing with North Korea. The same resource says that Trump may even be considering allowing North Korea to keep whatever nuclear weapons it may or may not have. US-based Politico has reported that Trump is considering a plan to let the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, keep its nuclear weapons and offer its regime financial incentives to stop making new bombs. If this were to happen, it would not only create fissures in its alliance with South Korea, but also halt the TSC entirely, it says. The TSC is the trilateral security agreement between the US, Japan, and South Korea that we mentioned earlier. If South Korea pulls out due to Trump, would Japan follow suit? After all, allowing North Korea to become the nuclear power it's always wanted to be doesn't just threaten South Korea. Japan and any other Asian nation that North Korea considers too westernized would be in its crosshairs too. What we see in all of this are the ingredients needed for Japan's faith in the US as its great nuclear ally and protector being shaken. Trump's trade war has only eroded that faith further, with Reuters pointing out that America's globe-sweeping tariffs originally included plans to tariff both Japan and South Korea at a 25% rate. Later negotiations saw the US reach deals with both nations that set the tariffs at 15%, but the fact that tariffs are even being discussed at all provides yet another reason for Japan's uncertainty in their US ally. And that's the key word, uncertainty. Japan simply doesn't know what the US is going to do next. It could be that the march that caused Europe and then Matsukawa to reconsider their positions on the US could have been a one-off bad month. Things aren't quite fully back on track yet, but it's possible that America's alliances with Europe and Japan will go unchanged during the rest of Trump's tenure, or something else might happen that rocks the boat even further, causing more questions and more calls for Japan to arm itself rather than rely on the US. There are already calls within Japan's political opposition to reduce the country's reliance on the US from a trade standpoint. On July 7th, Reuters reported on comments made by Hirofumi Yoshimura, who is the co-representative of the Japan Innovation Party. Japan should expand trade ties with the countries that focus on free trade, he said during an interview with Reuters. Instead of standing on just one big pillar like the US, Japan should stand on, say, 5 to 10 smaller pillars. That's a better approach to avoid its roof from falling in. Militaristically, Japan has also shown that it's trying to reduce its reliance on the US. The country is working to increase its defense spending to 2% of its gross domestic product by 2027. It also approved a $55.13 billion defense budget for 2025, which is the 13th consecutive increase in as many years, and a showcase of how Japan is slowly moving away from the pacifist policies of the past to a far more active and individualized defense. Adding its own nuclear weapons into the mix would only further help Japan to feel prepared for any future conflict within the Pacific without having the US ready to come to its aid. Speaking of future conflict, that brings us to the big reason so many in Japan want the country to have its own nukes: China. The reality is that China is already a massive nuclear threat to Japan, and it's only becoming more of a threat as time goes on. According to the Arms Control Association, China has a stockpile of around 600 nuclear weapons. The Guardian provided the same figure in a June report, adding that China isn't happy to stick at 600. It says that a report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated that China has been building nukes at a rate of about 100 per year since 2023. If it keeps the same pace, China will have hit the 1,000 mark by the end of the decade. That's a massive concern for Japan, even more so than North Korea's attempts to gain recognition as a nuclear power. North Korea can be seen as a pretender to the Pacific nuclear throne, albeit a dangerous one. China is the country that sits on that throne, and no other Pacific nation can touch it on the nuke front. Japan certainly can't. Even if the relationship it has with the US wasn't on shakier ground than it's been on in years, the fact is that China could hit Japan with nukes long before the US has a chance to defend its ally. And it's not like China isn't relishing in its ability to intimidate Japan. In July, The Independent reported that Japan was raising strong caution over the rapid acceleration of Chinese military activity near the coasts of Japanese territory and elsewhere in the Pacific. Just a month prior, a Chinese aircraft carrier group entered the waters near one of Japan's easternmost islands for the first time in history, demonstrating how China's intimidation tactics are becoming more brazen. Granted, China hasn't outright threatened Japan with a nuclear strike. That's not the Chinese style. However, aircraft carriers can carry strategic bombers. Those bombers can launch nuclear weapons. Putting two and two together suggests that Japan is very right to be wary about the threat China poses to its sovereignty. Japan has responded, as The Independent notes. Japan has accelerated its military buildup on southwestern islands in recent years, preparing to deploy long-distance cruise missiles as it worried about a conflict in Taiwan. which China claims as its territory to be annexed by force if necessary, the outlet said in July. It also pointed out that Japan is testing surface-to-ship missiles in what is a clear message to China that Japan is preparing itself to deal with the Beijing naval threat. But the fact remains that China has nuclear weapons and Japan doesn't. And for as long as that's the case, and especially when many in Japan are worried about whether the US nuclear umbrella still extends as far as the Pacific, that disparity will be a problem. We'll leave the final word to a survivor of the nuclear bombing of Japan, with whom Reuters spoke in August. That man is named Kunihiko Sakuma, and his comments reflect the opinions of many in Japan today, even those who have seen the horrors of nuclear weapons firsthand. Just because we're under the US nuclear umbrella doesn't mean we're safe. If nuclear weapons are used, it's over, isn't it? Real security only exists when there's mutual trust between nations. There is no mutual trust between China and Japan. And as long as that's the case, the clamor for Japan to arm itself with nuclear weapons will only grow. Japan isn't the only Indo-Pacific nation that believes that war may be coming and that it needs to prepare. Australia is also wary of the shifting strategic landscape in the region, and it's doing everything it can to prepare itself. Why is Australia quietly becoming a military superpower? Find out in our video. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the global military space. And thank you for watching.